Good morning, everyone. So, in the previous term, we've looked at some of the events that shaped the modern world in the 20th century, in the previous century. In this term, we are doing something slightly different. We are looking at some of the major events that shaped world history, from antiquity, from the ancient times to the 19th century. We're going to meet people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon. We're going to ask ourselves how the Vikings were able to reach America 400 years before Columbus and look at the human sacrifices of the Aztek people, among other things. Today we start this new path by looking at the Persian Wars, a conflict between the Greek city-states and the mighty Persian Empire in the 5th century BC. In particular, we'll be looking at the following points: the difference between BC and AD, which we will need to know if we want to survive this term. Then we'll see who are the Greeks, who are the Persians, why they fought, how they fought, and finally why the war was significant. At the end, I will give you a model answer to today's question, which is, why are the Persian Wars significant? Meaning, why are we studying this thing 2,500 years after the events? So, let's start by BC and AD. In the first part of this unit, which will cover antiquity, we will be using a lot of BC dates. What does BC mean? Now, as you know, we normally count the years progressively, from smaller to larger. However, we do not count them from the beginning of human history, which is much, much older than 20 years. We count it from the birth of Jesus, which is traditionally the year 1. However, when discussing the many events that took place before Christ, we use BC, which stands for before Christ. And they are counted backwards, as they are further away from year 1. So, the higher a BC date is, the further it is from the birth of Jesus. Okay? The lower a BC date is, the closer it is. Therefore, something that happened in 490 BC will have happened before something that happened in 323 BC. Okay? If it helps, you can think of BC as backwards chronology. So, the larger the number, the more the older a date is. I hope that's clear. Now that this is out of the way, we can start describing our contenders, the Greeks and the Persians. At the time, there was no single entity known as Greece. The Greek people lived in a series of independent cities called polis, which is the origin of our word politics. Politics as the art of administrating a city and, as an extension of that concept, an entire nation. Each city, each polis, had its own laws, its own coins, its own army. They practically were independent states. They recognized, however, that they had a common culture based around a common language. They both spoke Greek, the Hellenic language, and the worshipping of the Olympian gods like Zeus, Hera, Ares, Athena, and so on. You probably know them already. This did not, however, prevent them from constantly fighting each other, except during the Olympic Games, which were done to, worship the Olympian gods. They were held every 4 years in the Greek city of Olympia. During that time, all wars between the Greek cities would stop, and every city would send its own champions to compete in different sports. This is the origins of our modern Olympic Games, which happen every 4 years, and even though we don't really make peace during this time, we still think of them as the most prestigious competition in sports. And it comes from the Greeks, sort of. Now, we have already mentioned the Olympics, we have already mentioned politics, but a huge part of our culture, philosophy, art, our ideas of beauty, virtue, war, and so on, come from us straight from the ancient Greeks. They are one of the most influential elements in the development of our modern civilization. Let's move on to the Persians. Now, on the other hand, we have the Persians. Now, in most depictions, for example, if you've seen the film 300, which is cool, but it's completely non-historical, like completely. In most depictions like 300, the Persians are a caricature of the evil empire, okay? They are devious, they are decadent, they are evil, and they are an empire. But they were not. They were in fact quite benevolent, tolerant, and a sophisticated civilization. They freed, for example, the Jewish people from their Babylonian captivity. The Persians were also able to build a huge empire covering most of West Asia in only a couple of generations, which is a huge, impressive feat. However, unlike the Greeks, they were monotheistic. They followed the Zoroastrian religion. They did not have many gods, but according to whom you ask, either one or two. So the Zoroastrian religion essentially believes that there is a good god fighting against an evil god until evil is eventually defeated by good at the end of times. Also, unlike the Greeks, the Persians were all ruled by a single king, a single monarch, the Persian emperor. His title was Shahanshah, meaning king of kings, from the Persian word Shah, which means king. So Shahanshah, the king of kings. The full title is Shahanshah Iran Udaneran, Shahanshah of Persia, of Iran, and of non-Iran, of non-Persia. Their culture, religion and art left an incredibly important mark in the culture of the Middle East. If we, as a civilization, come from the Greeks, the civilization of the Middle East, of Central Asia, has been equally influenced by the Persians. Okay? To this day, variants of Persians like Dari are the international language in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in areas of Pakistan, Tajikistan, and so on. You got a map of the Persian Empire in the... forgot to put it in the slides. Now, why did these two people fight? So, the Persian Empire, as we said, ruled over thousands of different peoples all over the Middle East and North Africa. Among them, there were some Greek city-states in Ionia, a region that is now Western Turkey. The Persians, sick of these cities all constantly fighting with each other, even though they were under the king, and constantly having these political debates, they tried to impose on those Greek city-states some rulers which they did not like. They were called the tyrants. Tyrants is another word we get from Greek, from the Greek tyrannos. And therefore, since they didn't like these guys that were imposed on them by the Persians, these cities rebelled in 499 BC. The Greek city of Athens, which had very strong ties with the rebelling cities because they both spoke the same variant of Greek and they all believed they had common ancestors and so on, Athens decided to send help. The revolt failed, but the Persian emperor Darius decided to punish the Greek cities, especially Athens, for helping them and send a large army against them. After a long campaign, the Persians were defeated at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. According to the legend, you might have Marathon, I've heard this word before, yes. According to the legend, a runner named Philippides was sent from Marathon, the plain where the battle was fought, all the way to Athens, 54 kilometers. He ran all the way without ever stopping or catching a breath and dropped down dead immediately after announcing the Greek victory to the people of the city. The Persians tried a second time, 10 years later, under Darius' son Xerxes. This time, the Persians almost won, but as they were held back by the 300 Spartans of King Leonidas and his 6,000 allies, at the small pass of Thermopylae, the Athenians were able to create a fleet that took on the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, defeating them. That was the last time in history, as far as I know, that a Persian army threatened Greece directly. It was an existential threat to the freedom of mainland Greece, freedom of the mainland Greek cities. More than 1,000 years later, in 628 AD, some Persians would come close to reaching Greece during the last great war of antiquity, one of my favorite and most fascinating conflicts, the last war between the Romans and the new Persian empires. But these new Persians never crossed the sea. So, how did they fight in this war? A Greek victory during the Persian Wars was highly unlikely. The Persians had a huge army which were much wealthier and better organized. Their soldiers fought mostly as light infantry. They would protect themselves behind large wicker shields and shoot arrows before attacking the enemy with spears. They called these soldiers Sparabara, from the name of the shield Spara. The Spara, that was the name of the shield. They also had very good cavalry and some of the earliest horse archers. On the other hand, the Greeks liked to fight as heavy infantry. They were covered with bronze breastplates and had huge bronze shields called hoplon. Their tactic was forming a shield wall called the phalanx and charge against the enemy, or just run against the enemy with your spears. Most non-Greek peoples were not used to being charged by a wall of men covered in bronze, and very few Persian army could withstand the impact of a charging phalanx. This is what made the Greeks formidable warriors in their time, among other things. These soldiers were called hoplites from their shields. And one thing that is very important to understand, to understand Greek society and ideas like the idea of democracy that comes from ancient Greece, is that these soldiers were not professionals. They were not people who were paid to be soldiers, paid to fight. It was not their life. Their life was being normal people. It's just that when the cities needed them, every citizen who wanted to have some political rights, they needed to answer the call to defend the city. So, again, why are we talking about the Persian Wars 2,500 years after the events? So, because essentially our entire civilization would not exist without them. Or, if it would be very, very different. Now, first of all, the Persian Wars are the subject of one of the most ancient works of history surviving to this day, the Histories of Herodotus. It is the first war that was written about in detail and at length, and not just in triumphal inscriptions. We know a lot about even more ancient wars, but we only know that king named Supilupiluma, that's an actual name of a Hittite king, went to fight against, the king of the Assyrians, and he won. They never write about the defeats, of course, because those are triumphal inscriptions, but we know very little else. The Histories of Herodotus, on the other hand, are the first attempt that has survived until today of writing a history book. So, that's pretty impressive. Also, due to the victory in the Persian Wars, the Greek city-states began a period of prosperity that allowed them to invent things like philosophy, politics, and classical art. All these elements, think of the idea of democracy, monarchy, republic, and so on, those all, most, except for republic, which is Roman, all come from the way the Greek thought about how to rule a city. All these elements are the very basis of our own civilization. If the Persians had won, maybe we would live in a world with different values, different religion, and maybe even a different language. Maybe there wouldn't have been a Roman Empire or a British Empire after all. And even if they existed, they would be almost unrecognizable. So, let's look at the model answer. Oh, no model answer. My bad. I will just read it from the transcript. So, the question is, why are the Persian Wars significant? So, the Persian Wars were two conflicts between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC, which has been described as the first major confrontation between East and West. Despite being outnumbered, the Greek won both wars. The significance of the Persian Wars lies in the fact that they are one of the earliest wars we know about, since they were the subject of the most ancient work of history ever written, the Histories of Herodotus. The defeat of the Persians also prevented them from occupying Greece and allowed the Greek civilization to prosper and become the basis of our own civilization. The war was fought because around 499 BC, the city of Athens helped the revolt of some Greek cities against the Persian Empire. In order to punish them and to make sure that they would not support any more revolts, the Persian Emperor Darius sent an army against the Greek cities, but it was defeated at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and his son Xerxes was defeated at Salamis in 480 BC. So, looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.